lead us off with our land acknowledgement tonight. So, Karen.
Okay, thanks, Letitia. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we'd like to acknowledge that we are joining you from the region of the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. And as we all move forward, after experiencing our first day of observation of National Truth and Reconciliation Day, I am just going to pop in the chat a reminder of the calls to action, the link there, and just a direct reminder that for those of us that work directly in the sport and recreation sector, that calls to actions number 87 through 91 are specific to our industry, and that this document was not created specifically as calls to action to just the federal government, but to all Canadians, and that it is all of our shared responsibility to learn and do our part on this journey of truth finding and reconciliation. So that I will pass it back over to Letitia to share about our wonderful speaker tonight.
Thank you, Karen. So tonight we have with us Dr. Brianne Redquest, who is a postdoctoral associate with the Enhanced Lab at the University of Calgary. Using a multidisciplinary community engaged approach, the goal of her research is to explore and enhance the well-being of people with neurodevelopmental disabilities and their family members. One area of her research aims to understand the association between physical activity and well-being among individuals with neurodevelopmental disabilities and their families. Complementing her research pursuits, she has a strong passion for community engagement. To date, she has co-developed and co-led 3 adapted physical activity programs to improve the physical endurance, strength, and social and motor skills of youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Brianne, welcome. And if you're ready, I'll let you take it away.
I'm on mute. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Letitia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and let's hope it goes on. Can everybody see that? Awesome. Okay. So there we go. So I'm going to talk about the impact of physical activity among children and youth with developmental disabilities. So I completely welcome questions throughout, but I will be honest, I'm really bad at monitoring the chat as I talk. So if I miss some questions, I will most definitely attend to them at the end of this talk. Okay. Ooh, there we go. Okay. So what am I going to be talking about tonight? So first, I'm going to discuss the physical activity levels, what the guidelines are. Then we're going to delve a little bit deeper into neurodevelopmental disabilities. So we're going to discuss the barriers, the impact, and then we're going to talk about how we're addressing those barriers and some next steps with regards to my research. And then I think we shall end with enough time to delve into some of your questions. So first off, how much physical activity should children and youth be getting? So there's some guidelines that tell us exactly how much. And if we look at children between the ages of 5 and 11, we see that they should get 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So a good way to acknowledge this is probably that they have some physical exertion. So they're probably heart rate's higher, they might be sweating, it might be difficult for them to have a conversation. So you would indeed know that they are being physically active. So again, that's 60 minutes daily. Now let's look at our 12 to 17-year-olds, and we actually see the exact same. So we'd ideally, for health benefits, we'd like them to engage in about 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity of physical activity daily. So the question is, are we meeting these guidelines? And the answer is absolutely not. So they give us this report card and we got a big D+. So we know that children are not meeting these guidelines. So if we look at specific numbers, 35% of children between the ages of 5 to 17, unfortunately, are not meeting these guidelines. Now, you might realize or recognize there that these are quite dated. So this is going back to 2014 and 15, but 2019 data also tells us that they're not meeting the physical activity guidelines. In fact, I think they are doing a little bit worse. And as I'm sure you are all familiar with, they are becoming even more inactive due to the COVID pandemic. So that's more so the general population, but let's look specifically at children and youth with developmental disabilities. So what is that literature telling us? Are they meeting the physical activity guidelines? And how does their physical activity compare to their peers without developmental disabilities? So I pulled a study. This is just focusing on autistic children, and this is a systematic review that was conducted by Jones and her and team in 2017. So what they did is they looked at a bunch of studies and they kind of give us the general findings. So what we hear from this study is that autistic children and youth are indeed less active and more sedentary when compared to their peers without autism. So we know that the typical or the neurotypical children are not meeting the guidelines. And then we now know that our autistic children and youth are not even comparing to the guys that aren't meeting the guidelines. So they're unfortunately very inactive. This research further found that as they got older, their PA levels decreased even more. If we look at sex, so females versus males, this systematic review in particular did find that there was inconsistency. So while some studies said that the male autistic youth or children were more active than the females, other studies actually found the opposite. However, if we look at the body of literature, I think the common consensus is that males are a bit more active than their female counterparts. So let's look at some other factors that are contributing to these low physical activity levels among autistic children and youth. So looking at some studies, we see mother's education does play an impactful role. So the less educated the mother is, the less PA that their children is engaging in. We also see with increased autism severity, we see lower levels of PA, single parent homes, and comorbidities. So this would be additional diagnoses such as ADHD or mental health concerns. We also see lower levels of physical activity. Lack of social support also plays a large role in PA levels. So again, we see, the less friends or the less social support that the child has, the less likely they are to be active. So while this is all alarming and very worrisome, I think that what really concerns me is that we're looking at children and youth here. So the issue with that is a lot of these habits that we form, such as being active, are really developed while we're children. I think it's by the age of 9, we develop all these habits. So if we're seeing inactivity in children and youth, we can only predict that they're going to be inactive during adulthood, which is concerning because we know that PA or physical activity can offer a lot of benefits to issues that arise when we age. So while this is all about autism, you might be asking, do we see this across other developmental disabilities? And we absolutely do. So we see individuals with intellectual disabilities also reporting low levels of physical activity. We see children with Down syndrome also reporting low levels of physical activity. And children with cerebral palsy also reporting low levels of physical activity. So this is all concerning, but if you look at the literature that identifies all the barriers that these kiddos experience to physical activity, it's extremely predictable. So there's a nice body of literature that identifies all these barriers, and they categorize them into 4 different categories. So we have personal, social, environmental, and policy and program. So let's just look at some personal barriers. Now there's several, I've just chosen to take out 4. So what we hear and what we see is lack of skill is a huge barrier. So this could pertain to physical skills. So they might feel like they're physically inadequate, which is preventing them from becoming physically active. It could pertain to their disability itself that's preventing them from being active. And then lack of social skills. So because they might feel not entirely confident with their social skills, they're less likely to be active. And then there's this piece of lack of knowledge. And I think if you're in the physical activity world, sometimes we take this for granted. We can go to the gym and we can work out, or we can go and exercise and know exactly what we're doing or kind of what we're doing, or we can jump on a sport team. But this knowledge isn't common knowledge to everybody. So a lot of these children and youth are reporting that they just don't know how to exercise. The third is fear. So fear can translate across several different areas. So one is fear of injury. So this fear that they might get hurt. And of course, so you might take somebody with CP who might be vulnerable to physical injury. So of course that fear is validated. And then the next fear is fear of being teased or stigmatized. And then the last one is quite simple, is that they actually just don't prefer physical activity. They'd rather prefer something a little bit more sedentary, like engaging in video games or Netflix. So now let's look at social. So we see time constraints is a huge barrier. So this pertains to the family as well as the child. So a lot of these children might be in therapies, whether it's speech language therapy, occupational therapy. So having something added to their schedule just might not be practical. So they might push physical activity aside. And as well for parents. So a lot of parents are working full time. They have children or more than one child. So trying to get them to that PA program might be a huge barrier. The next is parental concerns. And this kind of works as that protection paradox. So parents are concerned that their child might injure themselves or be teased in physical activity, which in turn prevents their child from being physically active. Lack of friends. So I think that a lot of us can think back to when we were physically active, and a lot of these activities that we did that were physical were with our peers. So if you don't have friends, or they perceive that they don't have friends, it might prevent them from being active. The last one that I'll discuss is this negative societal attitude. Unfortunately, I think that often society might look at people with disabilities and think that they're not able to be active, so they shy away from it, which is unfortunate, because I think some of the best athletes that I've met do have disabilities, right? So they're very capable. Now let's look at environment. The first one is inadequate facilities, and I think this captures a lot. So this could pertain just to accessibility. So perhaps there's stairs, or preventing a child if a child can't use stairs, they can't get to the physical facility. But I think the main one that is the biggest barrier that I hear is this sensory concerns. So if you think to a gym, you think loud noises, bright lights, it's usually echoey. And for children with sensory concerns, this is a huge barrier. This is not accessible to them. The next is transportation. So if they have to take transportation, their cost might be an issue, but also the accessibility of transportation might be just an added barrier and an added time constraint. Now let's look at policy and programs. So we see lack of programs. So I think that's changing. I'm proud to say that I hear more about adaptive programming, so that's great. However, people might not be aware of those opportunities. Also, a lot of the programs that are offered are team sports. So from what we hear from children with disabilities is that they actually would rather do something individualized, because they might not want to socially engage and partake in a sport. The next one is lack of staff capacity and knowledge. So there might not be enough staff to offer one-on-one support for children with disabilities, but then there's also this lack of knowledge piece. So people who are leading these programs might just not know exactly what adaptations they should provide children with disabilities, or they might not exactly feel confident with their ability to communicate. So this lack of knowledge piece is definitely a barrier. Now, looking at these barriers, as you can see from the studies that I've referenced below, these are quite dated. However, with the COVID pandemic, I think all of these barriers have definitely been exacerbated, unfortunately, which is probably a huge contributor to the lack of physical activity amongst kiddos with disabilities. So let's talk about some benefits. So we talked about the physical activity guidelines. We know that they're not meeting the guidelines. We know why. We understand that there's tons of barriers that are definitely contributing to this physical inactivity. But let's talk about the benefits. Let's talk about why we should really address these barriers and get these guys active. So the first is physical health. So we see children with disabilities more vulnerable to obesity or diabetes. So the benefit of physical activity is that it can definitely reduce their risk for these issues. Mental health, we definitely see a decrease in depression, anxiety, internalizing behaviors. Social and motor skills are definitely improved with physical activity. I'm not going to delve too deep into those because I'm going to focus a little bit more on those benefits for the remainder of the presentation. Academic performance, we see increases in attendance and just grades. Sleep quality and quantity can definitely improve with physical activity. And pain, so children who have developmental disabilities who report high levels of pain. So for an example, we see this in the cerebral palsy population. With physical activity, we actually see some decreases in pain. So like I mentioned, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into mental health and social and motor skills. So we know children and youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities actually report higher rates of mental health issues. So let's look at children with FASD, for an example. We see 90% of children with FASD report having a mental health concern. So this might be depression, this might be anxiety. Same with autism, Down syndrome, we definitely see higher rates of mental health issues. So there's a body of evidence to support that physical activity might reduce these mental health concerns. So my colleagues, Stephanie Howe, Hansel, and Dr. Carly McMorris, my supervisor, we conducted a systematic review. And the systematic review looked at all these interventions, physical activity interventions, for children and youth with autism and or intellectual disabilities. So these interventions were mostly structured and they were in groups. And some of the sports were football, swimming, yoga. So we looked at all this data. Oh, and the age group varied from, I think it was 5 until 21. And what we saw is all these studies actually reported significant decreases or increases in areas that would improve mental health. So we saw significant decreases in stress. We saw increases in emotional stability. We saw increases in well-being, and we saw decreases in anxiety, decreases in internalizing behaviors, and increases in quality of life. So this is all great, but I do want to highlight some of the limitations that were evident through these studies. So the first is that the majority of the programs actually had a cost associated with them. So if we go back to our barriers literature, we see, which I didn't actually mention during this presentation, that cost can be a huge barrier. So the people that are joining these programs were able to afford the cost of the program. Now, the other concern is a lot of these programs were developed by the researcher. So within our research, we're seeing a huge move in including patient engagement. So that would be working alongside children and youth with autism, in this case of the systematic review, autism and or intellectual disabilities, to get them to help us create the program. So having them inform the program would actually make it more accessible, more feasible, and more enjoyable to them. So those are the main limitations, and we're going to talk about it at the end of this presentation of how I would like to address those in my research. Oops, sorry. So that's how PA can really directly benefit our mental health. But if we take a step back and we can actually see how physical activity offers this really unique opportunity to indirectly benefit mental health. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about my research, which is unpublished right now. It's in the making, talking about mental health literacy. So what we see with individuals with developmental disabilities is that they have poor mental health literacy. What I mean by that is that they're less likely to acknowledge that perhaps something might be impacting their mental health. So for an example, for me, I might realize if I'm on the couch a lot, I'm not talking to my peers, perhaps my mental health isn't at its best right now, and it might encourage me to get help. However, we know from research that unfortunately, children with developmental disabilities lack this mental health literacy. So sport offers this really unique setting to teach mental health literacy. So physical health and mental health are so entwined that why not encourage athletes to be more aware of their mental health, and I help them identify ways that they can detect that perhaps something might be impacting their mental health. Coaches are also in this unique position because they see their athletes often, that perhaps they can identify when somebody might not be doing so well. So my colleagues from CAMH and Dr. Carly McMorris, my supervisor, as well as colleagues from York University, and I hope I'm not missing anybody, partnered up with Special Olympics to create this tool. And the tool is called Understanding My Strong Mind. And what it is it's a mental health literacy tool. So within this tool, it has different categories. So it has relationships, it has daily habits, it talks about what they eat, it talks about hygiene. And we actually developed this tool alongside Special Olympic athletes. So what we want to gather from this tool is their normal. So what is their normal? So recognizing that my normal and your normal might be very different. So when I'm saying mentally at my best, perhaps that does mean that 8 hours of that is sitting on the couch watching Netflix. However, when you're at your best, you're moving around. So if the table's turned and you were sitting on the couch for 8 hours, it might red flag that something might be wrong. So this is what that tool is doing. So what we ask is we ask athletes to complete this when they're feeling okay. So this is like their baseline of their mental health. And then we really ask them to kind of refer back to it often so that they can detect when they're kind of deviating from that. But it also offers coaches the opportunity to detect that something might be wrong with their athletes. So we also provide copies of these to the coaches. And that way, if they see, say, John, who might be acting out, he's screaming a little bit more than usual, he's talking about imaginary friends, the coach can pull out this Understanding My Strong Minds and see if that's typical behavior for John. Now, if it's not, then he can talk to John, he can talk to the caregiver, and hopefully identify what may be going wrong mentally earlier, and then support and treatment can be implemented immediately. Sorry about that. So let's talk about social and motor benefits. And this brings me back. I did a lot of social and motor looking at social and motor abilities in children with developmental disabilities during my PhD. So this is the research I'll discuss right now. So we know children and youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities do indeed exhibit social and motor challenges. So let's say for autism, for example, social challenges is a core feature of autism. So typically this is characterized by difficulty initiating social interactions and perhaps having trouble perceiving social experiences. So while this is a core characteristic of autism and many other developmental disabilities, motor challenges are not. However, they're very common. In fact, in autism, a lot of the research talks about motor challenges as being associated symptoms. So what we see in children with developmental disabilities is that they do have motor challenges such as balance issues, lack of coordination. So catching and throwing a ball might be very difficult for them. And so Megan Lloyd from UIT in Toronto or Oshawa, she does some really fascinating work in this area. And what she proposed is that there's this strong reciprocal relationship between social and motor abilities, particularly amongst autistic children. So with that said, social deficits, so when somebody is struggling socially, this may impact their motor skills, and then vice versa. So when a child has deficits motorically, it might act as a barrier to social skill development, which offers this really unique opportunity for physical activity. So physical activity can enhance motor skills. And if we can enhance our motor skills, we can assume that we'll see an improvement in social skills. And then the opposite is also true. So if physical activity can improve social skills, then it can also in turn improve motor skills. So for my PhD dissertation, I looked at this relationship qualitatively, and I found that it absolutely exists. So what I did is I interviewed caregivers of children with developmental disabilities, and I talked to them about their motor skills and their social skills. And what I found is that when a child exhibited strong motor skills, it really presented this opportunity for them to improve or just engage socially with their peers. So the first quote is from a mother of Daniel, and Daniel had autism, but he was a really great hockey player. So the quote reads, Daniel's gross motor skills promote extracurricular activities, which he enjoys, which promotes social activity in team sport. The same was mentioned by Grace, who was a mother of Greg. She said, because he is really physically capable, it is probably enhancing his social skills. When he is doing something he is comfortable with physically, then it helps him engage socially, which he wouldn't otherwise have done. So we see if there's an increase in physical activity, it can improve motor skills, which can improve social skills. Or we see an increase in physical activity, we see an increase in social skills, and then an increase in motor skills. While this relationship is advantageous for some, it's not advantageous for all, unfortunately. So I talked to some mothers in this situation. They were both mothers of females of children with developmental disabilities. And we saw the opposite, unfortunately. So Diane, who is the mother of Sophia, spoke about how her daughter really wanted to engage with her peers. She wanted to play soccer with her peers, but she had a lot of motor challenges. So her balance was a little bit off. She was super clumsy, which made her a little insecure about herself. So Diane stated, I think that because she is a little clumsier or a little more awkward, not sure of herself, I think it definitely affects her socially. She is not one to want to join kids in the play yard or playing soccer. She tends to shy away and just think she can't do it. I find her physical and social, they don't go well together. So I unfortunately didn't provide the quote of somebody about her daughter who had autism. She was a really great softball player. She apparently, she was really great. However, socially, she didn't get along, or her peers didn't socialize with her as often as they socialized with the other teammates on the team. So she ended up getting bullied. She wasn't invited to team get-togethers, which ended up causing her daughter to drop out of softball. So in this case, we see something similar to what we're talking about, but in a situation where she could have advanced her motor skills and pursued softball, we saw actually that her social challenges kind of ended that, which is really unfortunate. So this is really concerning. And the next part is just as concerning. So while we talked about, social deficits that their children were experiencing, we talked about some of their motor challenges. We also talked about how perhaps they were all related. I asked parents if they were concerned about their child's social difficulties. And while they were extremely concerned about their social difficulties, asked, well, are you concerned about your child's motor difficulties? And all of them said no. The only concern that they really had around physical activity and their motor challenges was safety. So the issue here is that there's obviously a relationship that we're seeing, but if parents are less concerned about their motor difficulties, then perhaps they'll work on those less. And then we'll see this relationship where their motor deficits might inhibit their social development. So I think to really address this is that we need to educate people of this relationship and the importance of addressing one to promote the other, and essentially addressing both. So again, I think that if we can encourage physical activity early in life, this will definitely not just promote motor skills, but it will also address the child's social skills. So we talked about some sad stuff. We talked about how children just are not meeting those physical activity guidelines. We know why. The barriers are definitely clear and they're there. We also understand the benefits and why it's super important for children to engage in physical activity, and not just for their physical health, but also for their mental health, their social health, their motor abilities, school. So let's talk about how we can address those barriers and get these children active. So during my PhD, my master's and my PhD, which I did at Wilfrid Laurier University at Waterloo, my colleague, Dr. Reinders, and I collaborated to create a physical activity program called Movin' and Groovin'. So I helped run this program for 5 years. And I think that the program offered a lot, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. So right now, I'm proud to say we finally got our paper accepted. And this paper describes Movin' and Groovin' and the successful ingredients. So we talk about what we think really promoted Movin' and Groovin' success. So in addition, we're also working on an evaluation paper. So we talk about several successful ingredients. However, for now, I'm going to just talk about 3 main ones. So I think the biggest thing that we found with Movin' and Groovin' was the small class size. So we did a lot of trialing with Movin' and Groovin'. We initially began with a large group. I think it was 20 kids, and then we reduced it to 15. And then I think by the end, we had it between 10 and 12. Now, the benefit of the small class size is that it allowed us to provide one-on-one support and really get to know the individuals. It also really helped us provide structure and routine in the program. So the program, it started with a circle where we talked about, the benefits. It was a little bit of an educational piece just to get everybody's energy down. We talked about the benefits of physical activity, about healthy eating, and then we engaged in a warm-up. And this was then followed by working on one type of gross motor skill, whether it was throwing or catching. And then we ended the session with yoga, and that was followed by about 5 minutes of mindfulness. And we found that mindfulness piece was especially important because it just kind of got everybody's energy down a little bit. And then the class ended. So I don't know that structure and routine was possible when we had a bigger group. So when we had a bigger group, it was a little bit more unstructured, but I think the small class size definitely allowed us to implement that structure and routine. And while it was really difficult at first, I think by the 3rd or 4th session, we really got the children understanding this is the routine, this is the agenda, and we're going to stick to it. The next part that I think was really successful was this idea that we promoted opportunities. So the age group of this Movin' and Groovin' was between the ages of 5 and then up until 16. So while we had participants age out of our program, we didn't want to lose them entirely. So we asked them to fill the role of being a junior volunteer. So we asked them to partner one-on-one. Typically they had another volunteer as well. And then they'd work one-on-one with a child. I think that this was really important because it provided this sense of autonomy. I think that from what we hear, children with disabilities, once they get to that age of 16 or 18 plus, a lot of opportunities for programming are lost. So this was a really nice piece. So they got to do the volunteer piece. And I think that and in talking to parents and in talking to the junior volunteer themselves, we definitely saw an increase in confidence. The next part I included, so my master's focused a little bit on the siblings of individuals with autism. And one of the main findings was that siblings were often left out of, they lacked a little bit of attention. So we invited siblings to also come to Move In and Groove In. We were able to provide one-on-one support to these siblings as well. And I think that it helped the sibling, but it also helped the caregiver. So the caregiver was able to kind of drop their kids off, have some respite. And I think that we see an improvement in attendance as well. So when we weren't including siblings, there was a lot of conflict of schedules. So they'd have to drop one child off here, another child there. So either the child wasn't able to come to Move In and Groove In, or they were late. When we started including siblings, we saw that benefit. So I think that was definitely an important piece to the program. So while that's my work, I also want to bring attention to other really great resources. So Dr. Chad Sutherland from University of Windsor came up with this manual, and it's called APEX, which is Adapted Physical Exercise Manual for Adults with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So this manual is free online, and it outlines different training routines specific to adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I think this is a really great resource because it offers adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities to complete these activities at home or at their own time. And then of course there's CAPA, Children's Adaptive Physical Activity Program, run through Mount Royal University, which is a great initiative, which I had the pleasure of checking out a few weeks ago. And with this program, they invite children with developmental disabilities. It's a 2-hour program on Saturdays. The first hour is done in the gym, and then the second hour is they're in the pool. And you could tell that the children very much enjoyed it. And then of course, we're here tonight, hosted by Calgary Adapted Hub. There's this great hub that connects families with various accessible adaptive programming. And I think that this is a really nice piece. So what we hear is that parents don't really know which programs are available to their children. So by having this hub where it's kind of a one-stop shop, it offers parents to quickly access or find what they're looking for. So what are the next steps? So I talked a little bit about my research, where it has been, and now I'm going to talk about where it's going. So I'm doing my postdoctoral associate with Dr. Carly McMorris, and my main project is looking to co-develop a physical activity program alongside children with developmental disabilities. So working alongside them, I think this is the one piece that has been missing from a lot of the adapted physical activity programs that we read about in literature, is that a lot of these programs are not informed by the youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities. So for this program, I'm working with an advisory of 2 caregivers and 2 youth. So they're going to inform the major elements of the program. So this might include, you know, the length of the program, how often it's run, which activities, how many children. but this content will also be informed through survey and interview data. And then the next one, so from this program, I'm going to evaluate the well-being and quality of life of physical activity. So I'm going to ask participants to complete research measures regarding their mental health before the program, after the program, and then a follow-up to see if the physical activity program does indeed improve mental health or well-being. As a secondary purpose, I'm looking at secondary health impacts. So we know from literature that physical activity will improve sleep quality, social and motor abilities, and pain. So I'd like to look into that a little bit more in depth and extend that literature. And then we have this idea that physical activity at 60 minutes per, children should engage in 60 minutes of physical activity per day. However, it's a little bit unclear whether this pertains to children with developmental disabilities and if this is the amount of physical activity that we need to see improvements in well-being, such as mental health. So I'd also like to explore that. And finally, I'm really interested in this cascading impact. So I think that physical activity programs, while it offers a lot of benefit to the child, I think that we'll also see cascading impacts on the caregiver's well-being as well. So I'll be also looking at that. So ultimately, goals of my research, I think the one piece that really I want to focus on is that PA or physical activity offers numerous benefits that extend beyond physical health. I want to emphasize that while PA can definitely help mental or physical health, which is great, it offers benefits in other domains as well, such as social skills and motor skills and mental health. I would love to get to a place where physical activity is a prescription. So in addition to medications or therapies, physical activity is also prescribed, and it would be great if this could be supported through funds. Now, I think that we are doing a really great job addressing the barriers to physical activity for children and youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities. So we're seeing a lot more adaptive programming. We're seeing costs are reduced. So that's really great. And I spoke to one of my colleagues, Dr. McKirkin, and we talked about, I said, I just don't get it. There's all these programs and we're still seeing these really low levels of physical activity among these children. What is going on? And she brought up a really great concept. And she said, I think it's about empowerment. How do we empower children and youth with NDDs to become more active? So how can we increase their confidence and how can we encourage them to be physically active? So I'd really like to focus on that piece as well. And I think that if we can address these goals, we will see increases in PA engagement among children and youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities. And with increased PA engagement, I do think that we'll see an improvement in overall well-being and quality of life. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'd love to take any questions or just have a discussion on this material.
It's noisy in my background here. Apologies, but I'll start with a comment. Well, first of all, what an incredible presentation. So thank you. Lots of really great information in there. I really enjoyed the piece about the siblings because that was kind of a passive realization that WinSport had with their multi-sport adapted program here in Calgary, that it's open to full family, and it was not for, it was a happy accident. It wasn't based on any type of, originally planned for any type of reason. Just, it was meant to just be fully inclusive. And that was some of the best feedback that they received from families, was that it could be a full family and that siblings were engaged, and those with developmental disabilities engaged so much more because they then had that safety and comfort of doing it with their sibling. So that's super cool to see that it wasn't just a happy accident with just their program, that they're certainly onto something and that your research supports that. I'm wondering about that relationship with social, gross motor skill, and physical activity, that triangle there. So for kids that maybe identify themselves as in the gray zone, was there any programs that were more inclusive in nature rather than adapted program versus like typically developing programming? Because I just hear lots from families that we work with that their kids might identify themselves as being in a bit of a gray zone. So might have pretty good function relative to peers my age that have CP, but I can't keep up to my typically developing peers, but I don't feel as though I want to restrict my mobility so much that I want to get into parasport necessarily. So I find myself in this gray zone is a comment we often hear from families. And so just wondering, like, yeah, if there's any literature or anything you've seen about inclusive programs rather than adapted specific programs.
Yeah, it's a good question that you bring up. And we qualitatively, we actually have explored that, and the findings are quite interesting. So we see that inclusive programming is beneficial in that children that are in that gray zone, it offers them a little bit more of a challenge to reach their peers. However, I think that the biggest barrier is that there's not many inclusive programs. And I think it goes back to that lack of knowledge piece, right? So if you have an instructor who's leading a swim class, they might not be entirely comfortable or confident to work with a child that might have a disability, whether it's severe or not, which then might in turn impact that child's success in the class, right? So I think that inclusive opportunities are really great. I think that there is research to say that it is impactful and beneficial, but I think that maybe you will experience more barriers in situations like that than as opposed to something that has been adapted for children with developmental disabilities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Oh, so I see Tiffany, it might be worth reaching out. Awesome, I will definitely check that out. Thanks, Tiffany.
Hi, Brianne. Thanks so much for your presentation. It's fantastic. It's nice to see you in person. I know we've had lots of emails, and I wondered if you could just speak a little bit more to your co-design approach, and specifically maybe some of the challenges you see moving forward with co-design with the partners that you've identified, and how you plan to sort of maximize that opportunity to use that type of an approach to developing the program.
Right, yeah, so I'll discuss a little bit about the process, and then I can talk about some challenges that we've definitely encountered. So right now, the process is that we have our advisory team. So as I mentioned, we have 2 youth, and then we have a caregiver, and we're working with them first to create the data collection tools. So we created an interview guide with them, and that interview guide is really getting at that physical and mental health piece, but as well as informing the design of the physical activity program. I think the one barrier right now that we are experiencing is that it's all done virtually. So we're meeting online, and I think that offers additional challenges just in regard of communication difficulties. So that is definitely one barrier that hopefully will be removed in some time. I think the other barrier that I have encountered, not just regarding this research, but some research that I've done in exploring mental health interventions, is perhaps this power imbalance. So we'll ask for feedback and we'll say, how does this look? And they say, oh, it looks really great. And I'm like, no, you got to tell me you got to tell me the bad things. What's bad about this? So I think trying to pull that out can be quite challenging. And that is definitely the information that we need. So I've learned that in the past, and one step that I'm trying to take to mitigate that barrier is really building a rapport. So although my my idea is to get this done in a year. I think the importance of building a rapport and a relationship with our advisors is so important. So taking that extra time and not talking about research, talk to them about themselves, like build that, so you build the confidence and that trust. I think that if you miss that step going forward to continue working with them, it's just not going to be as effective. I think that's the biggest piece that I've learned from my past doing this research and I'm bringing forward. And so far, I think that I'm getting a lot more information than I have in the past.
Thanks so much for that.
Of course.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Brian, for your interesting presentation. I so much enjoyed that. And the fact that we have overlaps in our studies made me more curious about the qualitative study that you did on the relationship of physical activity and social skills. It was just interviews with the caregivers and parents. How was that, and what was the main? What was the other findings of that study?
So about that social and motor study?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the purpose of it was really to explore the social and motor skills of children with disabilities and how that was impacted by physical activity. But in doing so, we learned a lot about physical activity experiences. So what worked and what didn't work. However, I do have to say that there was so much diversity across the sample. So while an individual sport like swimming really worked for one child, a team sport actually worked for another child. We also delved really deep into the type of motor and motor challenges that they had, which again, we saw not only diversity across the sample, but we saw diversity within the sample. So while one child would have really strong fine motor skills, they'd experience really big challenges with their gross motor skills. And while one children was really great or had strong fine motor skills, they had poor social motor skills. You know what I mean? So it was very diverse. So we really learned a lot about that. We looked a lot at social skills. And again, I think that there was more consistency regarding social deficits that these children exhibited compared to the motor deficits. So we saw similarities in terms of, preference to hang out with adults as opposed to peers, difficulty initiating contact with their peers. So it really delved deep into those categories separately. So the social, motor, and physical activity piece. And then we kind of put it all together and we asked about the relationships within that.
Interesting, because Dr. Dewey and I did a systematic review on the effect of exergaming on social behaviors of neurodevelopmental disorders. And it was like one of my questions that did you notice any relationship between the intensity of physical activity that they were involved with the social skills?
That's a really great question. I wish I could answer it, but we didn't take into account intensity. But I will say that when we recruited for this study, engagement in physical activity wasn't part of the inclusion criteria.
Okay.
However, if it was, I think that intensity, frequency, duration, that dose of physical activity is definitely a next step. I would love to hear more if you are conducting work in that area.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great and interesting area to research.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your comment. Well, I will leave it there. If there's any additional comments, please feel free to speak up. But also, I love chatting about this. So if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to chat more about this.
Thank you, Brianne. It was a pleasure having you speak with our group this evening. And we are definitely looking forward to collaborating more with you on our upcoming projects. I'm sure all this information has been wonderful to learn about now, but having you work alongside us will be very important for us as well.
Thanks so much, Letitia. I'm really looking forward to it as well. Well, have a great night, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much, Brianne. It's a fantastic talk. Really excited about the work you're doing.
Thank you so much.